Hello friends, this is a video on Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. As you might know, Thoreau was a Transcendentalist. Transcendentalism was a movement in the Romantic period in America, in the USA. And Thoreau was born in 1817 and died in 1862. He was a friend and disciple of the other major Transcendentalist, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he died just before the Civil War got over and emancipation of the slaves happened. In his lifetime, Thoreau was an ardent abolitionist who worked towards the abolition of slavery. But he did not live to see the slaves emancipated. Thoreau was a philosopher, environmentalist, a great nature lover, and he wrote about it also in his book Walden. There are only a couple of books actually published in his lifetime. One of these was Walden. Walden was about his experiment with self-reliance. Thoreau wrote also some poetry and essays like Civil Disobedience, and he was a leading transcendentalist. A quick look at Thoreau's works. As I told you, Thoreau is best known for his Walden or Life in the Woods, first published in 1854. It documents his experiences of living in solitude near Walden Pond in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is in New England, and it is in the north of America. Massachusetts, here he lived all his life, and in Walden he lived from 1845 to 47. This book shows his experiment in individualism and self-reliance. Another very important work by Thoreau is 1849 essay Civil Disobedience. That is what we are talking about today. Civil disobedience is related to, but it is not exclusively non-violent resistance to government. Later, Mahatma Gandhi in India interpreted it as non-violent resistance. Gandhi, inspired by Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, developed the concept of satyagraha or non-violent resistance. Civil in this context means relating to citizens' relationships with one another and the state. So civil disobedience is how the state, when it imposes certain unjust laws, the citizens should disobey those laws, redefining their relationship with the state, because the citizens have not only the right but also the duty to resist and disobey when the state does not do its duties properly. That is the idealistic conception of Thoreau, propounded in the essay Civil Disobedience. A quick look at Thoreau's philosophy and style. The writing style of Thoreau interweaves a close observation of nature, personal experience, and he writes with pointed rhetoric, very argumentative and powerful pointed style. Many times he uses symbols and invests his words and images with symbolic meanings, and also combines his writing with historical lore, stories or references to historical figures and events. And he also displays a poetic sensibility and political and philosophical austerity. He's a poet, philosopher, politician, and nature lover. All these elements are seen intermingled in his essays. Thoreau pursued philosophy as a way of life, and not solely as a lens for thought and discourse. Philosophy for Thoreau is a way of life, and it is not solely a medium for thought and discourse. You live philosophy. Thoreau had a great influence of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson was the essayist and founder of Transcendentalism, and both of them were associated with the place Concord in Massachusetts. Thoreau was born there and Emerson lived there. Concord was the center of a lot of political and philosophical thought at that time. And the first writings of Thoreau were published in the journal, The Dial. The Dial was a journal of Transcendentalism, published in the early 1840s, initially under the editorship of Margaret Fuller, and then under the editorship of Emerson himself. Thoreau criticized American social institutions in his writings, especially the institution of slavery. Thoreau lived at the time of slavery as well as abolitionism, and the North states and the Southern states of the United States were divided over the issue of slavery, which eventually led to the Civil War. And Thoreau supported the abolitionist government who wanted to abolish slavery. Under Abraham Lincoln, there was the move to abolish slavery, and this led to the Civil War and also the assassination of Lincoln. Thoreau was the proponent of limited government. This essay, Civil Disobedience, is a very powerful, eloquent plea for limited government. The government should not completely try to control the people. The people should retain their individuality and freedom. That is the theme of the essay, Civil Disobedience. Thoreau propagated the ideas of limited government and individualism. Now, the context of the essay. First and foremost, Transcendentalism. I'm not going into a very detailed analysis of Transcendentalism. It is there in the introductory video. Transcendentalism is the idealistic stance. Throughout this essay, you can see Thoreau's idealism because he got it from Transcendentalism and Emerson. It is an idealistic stance against materialism. In this essay, Civil Disobedience also, Thoreau argues against materialism and wealth. He says that we should live a limited, simple life. So the argument is against materialism, against tradition. That might be surprising, but the tradition of the Europeans was being actively rejected in these times. After the Americans got independence, they were actively rejecting the traditions of Europe. In essays like American Scholar, Emerson argued that Americans should rely on themselves without turning to Europe for everything. They should walk on their own feet. And Self-Reliance is also a major essay by Emerson. Thoreau and the Transcendentalists took an active and idealistic stance against conservatism and the orthodoxy of politics as well as Unitarian Church. Emerson even belonged to the Unitarian Church as a clergyman and rejected the influence of the church eventually. The Transcendentalists emphasized the importance of the individual and his need to transcend ordinary life. The need for the individual to transcend ordinary life and invest life with spiritual worth. Transcendentalism was a highly spiritual movement. Against traditional religion, they advocated spirituality. And they wanted to invest ordinary life and experiences with spiritual meanings. Transcendentalism and Thoreau believed that truth and meaning lie within the human soul or conscience, which is an idea that you see in this novel as well. It is within the human soul or conscience that meaning lies, and the individual should turn inward in solitude and practice self-reliance. These are all very romantic ideas. The exaltation of solitude and nature is a very deeply romantic idea that was already advocated by Wordsworth, Coleridge, and others in Europe earlier in the 19th century. And in America, the concepts of solitude and nature came to be linked with that of self-reliance. The next important context for the essay Civil Disobedience is abolitionism. As I already told you, abolitionism is the attempt or the movement to abolish slavery. There were widespread protests against slavery and slave laws at this time. The fugitive slave law existed at this time, and it was revived in 1850 after this essay was written also. The slave laws of this time denied slaves human rights and advocated arrest of the slaves without trial if they were found to have escaped. So there were widespread protests among the Americans against slavery at this time, especially the Americans in the northern states, in New England, especially centered in Concord, Massachusetts. Massachusetts government at this time supported slavery, and it helped its neighboring states also, which Thoreau refers to in the essay. But the people of Massachusetts at large, at least the minority that is, were against slavery. More and more people were coming up in protest against slavery. After this essay was published, there came the controversial Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, which helped slave owners and denied slaves the right to trial. The Fugitive Slave Law denied slaves the right to trial, and such laws, oppressive laws, were supported by the politician Daniel Webster and others. Thoreau refers to Daniel Webster in this essay and criticizes his stance in politics. Counter to the Fugitive Slave Law, there were also movements to abolish slavery, as I told you. The American Anti-Slavery Society was founded in Philadelphia in 1833, and it promoted nonviolent resistance. So Thoreau's idea of civil disobedience is not new. It was already practiced in the issue of slavery, as well as it was practiced during the American Revolutionary War. So the people of America were already familiar with civil disobedience as a political concept. Thoreau was critical of some of the indirect modes of resistance that the Anti-Slavery Society advocated. In Civil Disobedience, Thoreau says that disobedience should be direct. As soon as you find that a law is unjust, disobey it without waiting for it to be changed by somebody. He advocated more direct modes of resistance, even if it leads to imprisonment. Slavery eventually came to an end only at the end of the Civil War, at which time Thoreau was no more. The American Civil War was from 1861 to 65. And the slaves became free with the Emancipation Proclamation made by Abraham Lincoln, the Republican president of that time. Another context of the essay Civil Disobedience is the Mexican-American War. The USA under President James K. Polk started a war on Mexico in 1846. Mexico was a southern neighbor of America, a large part of Mexico at that time lay in the south of the northern American continent. Mexico was a big country at that time. And you know what the Americans did? The Americans waged a war on Mexico, took control over their capital, Mexico City, and seized land from Mexico in 1848. There was a very infamous treaty that led to this. Guadalupe Hidalgo, I don't know how to pronounce it. This land that America seized from Mexico is called Mexican Cession. And it formed the southwestern American states of today, like Texas, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, California, and parts of Colorado. These were all regions that belonged to Mexico at that time. Many Americans felt that it was their manifest destiny to seize that land. It was a very imperialistic act. See, these Americans had fought against Britain because of Britain's colonialism upon them, and now they have themselves turned into colonizers. They have themselves turned into imperialists, and they've continued to be so until modern times. And with this Mexican cession, the size of United States at that time almost doubled. United States was a very small country when it got independence. Now, it got almost double its size, almost, especially the agrarian South, which practiced slavery. And this led to the imbalance between the slave states and the free states. The free states of the North and the slave states, there was an imbalance between them. The slave states became more powerful, and the northern states where slavery was not practiced, they resented it. So the Mexican-American War was a very important issue at this time, and America was greatly divided over it. All these eventually led to the Civil War. The abolitionists, therefore, opposed the war vehemently. Now, we are going into the essay, Civil Disobedience. It was originally titled Resistance to Civil Government. Resistance to government is not a new thing. Probably the earliest example of civil disobedience you can find in Socrates. At the time when people are protesting against the government, it looks like it is an act of terrorism against the government. It looks like the government should crush it. But these acts of civil disobedience are what have maintained equality and peace and justice in the world. You can see that in history. In recent times in India, there has been a very momentous civil disobedience movement in protest against the CAA at Shaheen Bagh, which is the picture I have used here. Civil Disobedience is an 1849 essay, and the full title of that time was Resistance to Civil Government. It was derived from a series of lectures entitled The Rights and Duties of the Individual in Relation to Government. It was a series of lectures delivered by Thoreau at Concord Lyceum. It was an academic association, and that was in 1848, the previous year. Civil Disobedience, the title came only after Thoreau's death, and the essay shows his belief in the individual's right to self-determination. And the essay shows an anti-authoritarian perspective against governmental authority that oppresses the people. That is what the essay is. The term civil disobedience was coined by Thoreau to describe his refusal to pay the state poll tax implemented by the Massachusetts government to prosecute a war in Mexico and to enforce the fugitive slave law. Because Thoreau did not agree to the policies of the government, he sought to disobey the government by refusing to pay the state poll tax. He did that for 6 years before he was finally arrested. In those days, the machinery of justice was very different. And as I told you, the practice of civil disobedience is nothing new, even though the term is coined by Thoreau. The key argument in the essay is that individuals should not permit governments to overrule or manipulate their consciences. In those days, in the 19th century, it was still possible to protest against governments, to assert your independence and freedom, whereas these are practically impossible in today's time. If you refuse to pay the tax or if you speak out against the government, even if you make a Facebook post, you are liable to be arrested and charged for sedition. These are the times in which we live in. Anyway, Thoreau lived at a time when he was able to argue that individuals should not permit governments to overrule or manipulate their consciences, and that they have a duty to avoid allowing such acquiescence to enable the government to make them the agents of injustice. If you support the government by paying taxes, it is like supporting the unjust laws of the government and making them, and you become agents of injustice. You should not allow the government to make you agents of injustice. That is what Thoreau argues in this essay. Let us look at how the essay came to be written, the writing of the essay. The essay Civil Disobedience is a rejection of unjust government influence over the individual. The essay is a rejection of unjust government influence over the individual. And the essay is written in support of abolitionism against American imperialism. At that time, America was imperialistically engaged in a war against Mexico. It was written after he practiced civil disobedience in life by refusing to pay a poll tax for the past 6 years. He had refused to pay that tax for 6 years. From Walden, at that time he was living in Walden. For 2 years he lived in Walden, remember? Thoreau went to Concord. Actually, he went there to get his shoe mended, it seems. He himself says that in the essay. And at Concord, where he went, he was arrested by the town constable Sam Staples. All that is history now. The town constable Sam Staples arrested him and jailed him in Concord. And he was supposed to be imprisoned until he paid a fine, which also he refused to pay. It looked like he will be in prison forever. But then what happened? The next day, somebody, it is believed that it was his aunt, paid the tax on Thoreau's behalf, and he was released. Today, in today's times, if you refuse to pay the tax for 6 years, and then finally you are discovered and arrested, it will not be one night that you spend in jail. The essay is pretty obsolete in some of its ideas, in its idealism, and in the solutions that he suggests against injustice of the government, etc. But the issues are very relevant. In fact, even more relevant than in Thoreau's time. It is imperative that we talk about this essay now. The authorities probably did not realize what is in this essay when they prescribed it in the syllabus. It is imperative to talk about this essay now when the whole world is reeling under all kinds of oppression. from all sorts of authorities, not only the nation and its government, but also the corporations who rule over the nations. So, after Thoreau was released from prison, he went and took part in a huckleberry party. It is again an act of rebellion that he's going and enjoying with his friends, huckleberrying. That means picking huckleberries and partying with his friends as if nothing has happened. That he went and took part in a huckleberry party shows that he doesn't care what the state does to him. He doesn't care if he is imprisoned. He will continue to be what he is. That is the meaning. His protest was against the government's stand in the Mexican War and on the issue of slavery. Thoreau's basic premise is that a higher law than civil law demands the submission of the individual. The civil law or the law of the government is not the supreme law. There is your conscience above it. There is a moral law of God above it. Remember, the people of New England are very religious. Thoreau invokes God and the Bible several times in the essay because that is what the people will understand. So, he invokes a higher moral authority that is divine above the civil law. Human law and government are subordinate to that moral law. In cases where the two are at odds with one another, with each other, the individual must follow his conscience. When morality is in clash with the law of the land, when the government says one thing and you know that it is wrong, then ignore the human law. Go against the government. Follow the moral law. That is what Thoreau says. Thoreau refused to pay taxes, but this was a common means of protest in America at that time. It was not just him who did it. It was a common means of protest in America. No taxation without representation was the American Revolutionary War slogan. It was a very common thing in the American Revolutionary period as well. Remember, the American Revolution started with the rejection of the Stamp Act. The laws made by the British government were repudiated. That is how the American Revolution began in the 18th century. The Transcendentalist and Abolitionist Amos Bronson Alcott himself was arrested in Concord for not paying the poll tax a few years ago in 1842. Thoreau's friend Amos Bronson Alcott, who was the man who suggested the name The Dial to their magazine, he was also arrested in 1842 for the same reason. So let us go into the essay. I have put subtitles to the slides to show you the crux of the argument in each part of the essay. First, he asks, do we need a government at all? The essay opens famously with the sentence, I heartily accept the motto, that government is best which governs least. A government should govern least. The purpose of the government is not to breathe down people's necks, to oppress them with laws, to keep governing them. You will understand this very easily. If I tell you a very contemporary idea, that parent is best, a parent, father or mother, parent, that parent is best, who parents least. You don't have to go and parent your children and govern them and control them all the time. Let them free, let them be. That kind of parents are the best parents. We accept that. Like that government is best which governs least. Thoreau says he accepts it. And I should like to see it acted up to more readily and systematically. He says that should be practiced even more. He also believes that government is best which governs not at all. Why should the government govern at all? You don't have to oppress the people and control them all the time. When men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government which they will have. Thoreau believed that the time will come when the men are mature and prepared for such a country, for such a political organization, when there will be no government at all. There will be the need for no government at all. Thoreau speaks in support of the government that does not burst in on men's lives, that stays away from men's lives without governing people's lives unnecessarily. Remember, a very basic principle of political science is the idea that state is a necessary evil. The state or government is necessary, yes, but it is a necessary evil. You should not indulge in it. You should not indulge in submission to the government or the state. You should not indulge in, as a government, you should not indulge in controlling and governing the people. So, government is at best but an expedient. That is another argument that he makes. The government is at best but an expedient. That means, do not take the government too seriously. The government is just a tool to get things done. The government should be looked upon as a tool that we use for convenience, for practicality, to maintain law and order. In politics, one basic idea is maintaining law and order is what is more important than bringing justice to people. Justice is not the necessary foundation of any political act. Maintaining law and order is the practical approach of political science to a society. So government should not be taken too seriously. Just use it as a tool to maintain law and order, because anyway, by political definition, the state or government is not ultimately about justice. The government is only a means of attaining a goal. A government exists by the consent of the people for the practical purpose of executing their will. What is more important is the people, their moral judgment, their conscience. Thoreau is against a standing army as well. He says a standing army is as unnecessary as a standing government. Both the standing army and the standing government are a wastage. He believes that the government, which is only the mode in which people execute their will, is liable to be abused and perverted. The government, by nature, will not remain perfect and just. It is liable to be abused and perverted. So do not expect the government to bring justice or to be very moral in its actions. Be prepared to rebel. And the Mexican War is an example of how a handful of people use the government as their instrument. Some people, you can see very many examples from modern times as well. Some powerful people use the government and bring certain laws. Certain things become right and other things become wrong so that it will help some people, some communities, some classes, some regions. So the Mexican War at that time in America is an example of how some people are using the government as their instrument, even though a lot of people are against the war. This war is happening because the government supports some people. Now, we are moving into the first part of the essay after the introduction. The first part of the essay talks about government and democracy in detail. Governments, Thoreau argues, do not achieve their ends. The American government is but a tradition, though a recent one, says Thoreau, and like all traditions, the American government should also be questioned. This tradition should also be questioned. The American government is but a tradition and a recent one, and like all tradition, it must at some time be questioned. The government claims to do the best for posterity. The government always claims to do the best, but fails every time, he shows. Every time The government has only failed. Every government has failed. He's not talking about any particular political party or any particular government. All governments by nature fail and lose some of their integrity. The problem with the government is that it will never have the vitality and force of a single living man. As an individual, you have a moral sense inside you. There is godliness in you. That is the transcendentalist romantic perception. As an individual, you know what is right and wrong. But the government is like a corporation. It doesn't have accountability. It doesn't have a personality. It's impersonal. And it does not have the vitality and force of a single living man. However, says Thoreau cynically, the American government is necessary. It is a joke. He says, because the people must have some complicated machinery or other. Some machinery or the other should be there. And here it's din to satisfy that idea of government which they have. To understand that, okay, there is something there. Some government that is making noise we have. For that reason, we should have the government. In India, like everywhere else in the world, marriage is a weakening institution. I'm just giving you an example. Many marriages do not work out very well. Some marriages do, of course. Most of the time, we see that people are compromising with their spouses, putting up with them. But in India, the rate of divorce is quite less compared to the West, because we are conditioned to put up with marital situations. Compromise and adjustment is, the main thing. We like to get married and remain married, even if it does not work out very well, because we just want to know, okay, something is there. Like the people want the government, even though it is failing. We want the marriage, even though it doesn't work, just to satisfy ourselves and the society. That is the way in which people put up with their government, says Thoreau. Thoreau says that people should have some complicated machinery or the other, so they put up with whatever government they have, even though it is almost always a failure. Governments only serve to show how men can be imposed on for their own advantage. Governments are oppressive. Governments show how men can be imposed on. That is what governments do. Governments do not achieve their ends. Thoreau asserts that governments never achieve what we expect them to do. Thoreau asserts that governments never achieve what we expect them to do. He says it does not keep the country free. It does not settle the West. It does not educate. If the governments do not attain any of their goals, then why do we need them? These achievements, says Thoreau, have come from the character of the American people. It is not the government who did it. The American people have done it. And the American people would have achieved even more if the government had not got in its way. We are now living in the midst of Corona. And everybody is like praising the government for how they managed the spread of the disease and so on. Let me tell you another perspective on this. Let me argue that the government did not fulfill its responsibility. We, in the first place, do not have enough hospitals, and our public health care is very bad. We do not even have enough diagnostic services. We don't have testing services. People are just shut up in their houses very effectively, because the police will catch hold of you and sometimes even beat you or arrest you if you go out. Very nice. Very great practice of the government upon a free people. People are just shut up in their houses without any testing. We don't know whether we are carrying the virus or not. We don't know what is happening around us. We have a very mediated view of the whole corona issue through the media. We don't know what is the reality. And thousands, probably millions of people by the end of this would lose their jobs. People living in the Middle East and other countries will come back home in large, huge numbers. Lots of migrant workers have lost their jobs. They are walking like 2,000 kilometers back or more, sometimes back to their houses, dropping dead on the way, starving. We don't know about them. We don't care even. The government also apparently doesn't care. The government is apparently feeding people. But food is not the only requirement of a human life. I would argue that we are being treated like animals, or worse than that. What does the government do? This is a counter perspective. So, to show that Thoreau's arguments are also valid, there is some truth to it, probably a lot of truth to it. That is why I said this. So, if the people have remained in their houses and if there is less spread of COVID, it is because the people did it. The people took care. They understood, and wherever people did not mingle with others and stayed in their houses, there is less instance of COVID now. That is what happened. It is not to the government's credit. The government should install better public health care, better transport, better sewage system, better traffic, That is what the government should do, which is not what they're doing. And they are blaming us for making more waste, for driving our cars. All the time it becomes the blame is on the common people for what the governments do not do. So, Thoreau is saying that if there is any achievement in the country, he's talking about America, of course, these achievements have come from the character of the American people. And the American people would have achieved even more if the government had not got in its way. It is because government is an expedient. The government should be a tool to do things. What do you mean by expediency? Thoreau gives the rule of expediency here. Expediency is we don't necessarily do the right thing, but we do what is convenient and practical. By the rule of expediency, you pay bribes. Paying bribes, giving bribes is not right. Giving bribes is criminal and unfair. But you still, give 100 rupees to some official, or 1,000 rupees, or if your case is even more serious, 10,000 rupees, 1 lakh rupees, 10 lakh rupees, like that. Starting from 10 rupees, we give officials to get things done. We think it is okay. It is just to get this done. Let him take it. It's okay. That is the rule of expediency. For convenience and practicality, doing things, even though they are unjust. The government is like that. The government is an expedient, a means of political management. Only. It is not a means of bringing us justice. And the government must be let alone by it. And the governed must be let alone by it. Do not interfere too much in the lives of the governed, says Thoreau in the 19th century. Very relevant today, and probably too late. Is there any aspect of public life or your personal life where the government does not interfere, where the corporations do not interfere with the help of the government? Is there anything that you do in your life that is not under surveillance by the corporations and the government? Do you have privacy? See, the governed must be let alone by it. Today, in the 21st century, in the age of 5G, it looks like a joke. The governed will never be let alone by the government because the government is used by the corporations and the powerful people. By corporations, I don't mean only multinational corporations. I mean also religious corporations. I mean all kinds of power-wielding people. So, it's too late. The reality that we live through today is far worse than what Thoreau imagined. Let's proceed. Thoreau says governments retard progress. Thoreau turns to government restrictions on trade and commerce. Remember, in the time of Enlightenment and after, a lot of philosophers advocated free trade, less safer economy, for the first time put forward by Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations. And the American Revolutionary War was a result of government interference and restriction on trade and commerce. Thoreau is criticizing government restrictions on trade and commerce. He says legislators are continually putting obstacles in the way of trade and commerce. Thoreau humorously says that trade and commerce is able to overcome these obstructions and still able to go on, even though the government is causing innumerable obstructions to trade and commerce. If you are a big businessman, it's okay. If you are a small businessman, the tax departments, the corporation, the electricity board, the water authority, all these tentacles of the government will catch hold of you, try to stifle you, try to treat you like a criminal. You understand? If you are a small businessman, you will understand what Thoreau is saying. Thoreau says, even though the government is creating obstacles to trade and commerce and to people running businesses, somehow people are overcoming all these obstructions and still able to go on. Only because probably it is made of India rubber and thus able to bounce back. Trade and commerce are probably made of India rubber at that time. Rubber that was coming into the new world as a result of colonialism. Was referred to as India rubber, and it's one kind of rubber and very bouncy. Probably trade and commerce are made of India rubber. That is how they are able to overcome the restrictions of the government. Though the actions of the government have such undesirable effects, we still put up with them because their intentions are somewhat good. Even though that is how governments get away with it. Even when the governments do something and then it becomes a great disaster, like our demonetization in India, they get away with it because we think, okay, fine. Anyway, the intention was good. The intention was to remove black money. The governments will always project a great intention to do even wild things. To do even evil things, they will project a great innocent intention and sell that idea of the intention very much, because then we'll forgive them. Otherwise, if even that intention was not there, Thoreau says, otherwise governments would deserve the same punishment as the mischievous persons, meaning criminals, who obstruct railroads. Thoreau lived at a time when railroads were bringing great progress to America. The Transcontinental Railroad was built 1840s onwards. And some criminals obstructed railroads. And he says, if the government's intentions were not good, they would have been treated as criminals, like the people who obstruct railroads. Think of how governments in our country as well as other countries have derailed the economy, derailed the ordinary life of the peaceful, ordinary life of the people by very often stupid measures. We refer to one ancient king and call them Tughlaq, measures. So remember how people have been bothered by the government because of their stupid ideas and measures, which actually led to criminal offenses on the part of the government, such as the complete destruction of economy and peaceful life and health and so on and so forth, just because the government did not do their work. The governments in these ways retard progress. Thoreau shows that the country may be much better off without such governments who do not achieve their ends and only retard the growth of the nation. I'm reminded of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's father. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's father was one oppressive man who did not help his children, and if any of his children did anything good, he also retarded their progress. Did you understand? So, Thoreau asserts that he is not asking to eliminate government at all. Thoreau is not an anarchist. Thoreau is not asking us to eliminate government. He is not saying there should be suddenly no government. Eventually, in the future, probably that day will come, if we are lucky. But immediately, he is not asking to eliminate government, but he is asking for a better government. He is just saying that we should have a better form of government. I have put that metaphor here, the metaphor for a governed nation. Did you like that? And just a sour memory. But to speak practically and as a citizen, I'm reading from the essay. But to speak practically and as a citizen, unlike those who call themselves no government men, I ask for not at once no government, but at once a better government. Let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step toward obtaining it. He's suggesting that every man should make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step toward attaining that government. We should have a clear idea of what government we want. See, you should understand that we are all political people. If you are a citizen of this country, you can't avoid being political. I have heard many people say, I'm not political, I'm apolitical. That is an untruth. You cannot be. As long as you live in this country as an adult, as a voting or a person of votable age, you are a citizen of this country and you have a political life. Because the government and politics is impacting on your life in many ways. You should have a clear idea of what the role of your government should be and what kind of government you want. It is very important. And having a clear idea of what kind of government you should have is one step towards attaining it. Even if you don't have that government right now, we should have that idea. The very idea of democracy is flawed. That is what Thoreau shows next in this essay. Democracy is not infallible. In a democracy, we conduct an election. And the choice of the majority rules the country for a long time, right? Now, today we know that these elections are not foolproof. These elections are prone to rigging. People can manipulate elections. It has been proven several times. And the problem, even if the election is right, even if it is conducted right and justly, the problem is that the choice of the majority rules the country for a long, long time. For the next 5 years, you have to suffer the choice of the majority. And there is no guarantee that the choice of the majority is the right choice. That is the problem. Thoreau points out that the choice of the majority does not denote the most virtuous or the right. It only shows that the majority is physically the strongest. Why the majority's choice become the ruler or form the government? It only shows that the majority is physically the strongest. It does not mean the majority is right. And very possibly the minority is right. Because the masses or majority are usually dumb. So the problem inherent in democracy is that democracy does not bring us the right choice. Naturally, democracy will involve opposition, dissent, and criticism. The people who cannot accept the choice of the majority, they will keep complaining, they will keep protesting, they will show their dissent. Natural. A government chosen by the physically strongest need not and will not, Thoreau says cannot, be based on justice. If the physically strongest is ruling, That does not mean, it will not mean that it is a just rule. Did you understand? That is the problem with democracy. Thoreau asks why we cannot have a government that is not based on the power of the majority, but on conscience. Thoreau asks why we cannot have a government that is not based on the power of the majority. Why should we have a government that the majority chooses? Why can't we have a government which is based on conscience? Now, this is idealism, because it is a wonderful idea, but the problem with it is whose conscience? Because everybody's conscience is not the same. Everybody's morality is not the same. That is the problem with the solution that Thoreau gives. Thoreau's solutions are not acceptable, but the issues he raises are all very pertinent. So he says that conscience should be the right basis for a government. The majority should be given the right to decide not only on those issues where the rule of expediency is applicable. Some superficial issues where a practical solution is needed, in such cases, let the government decide. Let the majority decide. But in the case of some deeper issues where morality is important, justice is important, there the majority should not decide. Did you understand? The majority should be given the right to decide only those issues where the rule of expediency is applicable. You have to build a road, or you have to bring a bullet train into India. How do you do it? How do you make metro? How do you start metro service in a city? Things like that are not very moral issues. They are practical issues. However, whether a state should be given self-governance or whether a state wants to leave the country, I'm just talking in general about some state. Imagine a state has serious issues with the country and wants to leave the country. You can't just impose some opinion upon that state. You will have to go by the decision of the people there. So every issue does not demand the same kind of solution. I'm not a political expert or anything. I'm just giving some random examples so that my students of English literature will understand. People who know political science and thinkers in politics, they should decide which issues require the rule of expediency and which are serious moral issues. And these should be divided. And the government should not just arbitrarily take decisions where morality and justice are involved, because the government is only an expedient. I hope you get what I mean. This means the government elected by the majority should only be used as a tool to do certain things and not given the complete control of everything in the nation. Some issues are moral issues involving justice to people. There, the government should not have the final word. Must the citizen ever for a moment, or in the least degree, resign his conscience to the legislator? If the legislator, the people who make the laws, and even the Supreme Court who enforces the law, they can go wrong. As you know, they go wrong. They do immoral things also sometimes. I'm not just talking about India, I'm talking about every country in general. There have been issues in history where the court did not take the right decision, the moral decision, that is. The government did not take the moral decision. In India as well as every country, there are examples in history. So, in such cases, must the citizen ever for a moment or in the least degree resign his conscience to the legislator? Why has every man a conscience then? If you cannot exercise your conscience, if you cannot live by your conscience, if you have to follow the dumb rules that the state makes for you, then why do you have a conscience in the first place? Did God make a terrible mistake in giving you a conscience? I think that we should be men first and subjects afterward. Again, this is idealistic, not very practical, because this thing called men is not a very great thing. Men are not always moral and just. Men will want to oppress other people. Men will believe in discrimination. So all these men will not have a great conscience either. So what Thoreau says is not very practical, but it is very pertinent. I think that we should be men first and subjects afterwards. What is important, says Thoreau, is conscience. The most important thing, more important than our obligation to abide by the law of the land, is the obligation to do what our conscience deems right. For great thinkers, for great people, the obligation is to go by their conscience, because they might have a conscience. They have a conscience. Everybody has a conscience. But the understanding of great thinkers and people, I suppose, may be probably better than that of ordinary people because of their learning and exposure to great ideas. So, at least for them, more important than the obligation to abide by the law is our obligation to do what our conscience deems right. Think of activists like Medha Patkar or Arundhati Roy or Noam Chomsky or Irom Sharmila, for example. So many examples you can think of. They did what their conscience is right. They went against the law of the land. An individual's conscience should not be silenced by the opinion of the majority. Even though the majority elected one government, which you cannot accept because your conscience tells you it is immoral, it is wrong, what they're doing is wrong. Even if the majority says that is right and gives its support to the government, you alone should stand against it. This is what Gandhi also did. A lot of people in India wanted British rule. They were not enlightened enough to understand that they should rebel. They should get freedom. They thought British rule is wonderful. Gandhi's movement started very small and gathered momentum. At first, there were only a very small number of people who stood against the majority and said, no, we want freedom, because that is what their conscience told them. The problem is not with law per se. It is not the law that is the problem. These are not Thoreau's words. I'm saying this, interpreting Thoreau. The problem is not with the law per se. The question is whether men have exercised their conscience in making and enforcing laws. Sometimes laws are unjust. But every law is not unjust. Sometimes the interpretation of the law or the enforcement of the law is what is unjust. So the question is whether men have exercised their conscience in making and enforcing laws. Thoreau is not saying that there should be no law in this land and that every law should be rebelled against. No. What he's saying is, when laws are made and enforced without the conscience, then probably they are immoral and should be resisted. A corporation has no conscience. This is Thoreau saying. A corporation has no conscience, but a corporation of conscientious men is a corporation with a conscience. By definition, a corporation or government does not have a conscience because that is not a man. But if there are conscientious men in the government, if there are conscientious men in the corporation, then that corporation will be one with a conscience. Law by itself does not make men just. Just because there are laws, that doesn't mean men are just. There can be a country with very just laws, but with an immoral government. You understand? Just because there are just laws, that doesn't mean people are just. In fact, blind respect for law has led men to injustice. If you obey law blindly, without questioning it ever, even when it goes wrong, if you go on obeying law, you are actually perpetrating injustice. Blind respect for law might lead you to injustice. Blind nationalism might lead you to injustice. Blind respect for religion might lead you to injustice. A lot of communal riots and killing of other communities is happening because of people's blind respect for religious law. It is a misuse of law. It is not something that God will be happy about. Here, law is being misused without conscience. Because the law that religions made or God made probably is not bad. The law of the religion is probably not bad. It is the interpretation and enforcement of it that is bad. Because you do it without your conscience. Thoreau thus criticizes the lack of judgment, the lack of moral sense, and the lack of conscience in the way men serve the state. Thoreau says an individual should not bend over obediently to the state's authority without disregarding himself. An individual should not bend over obediently to the state's authority without regarding himself. Sorry, not disregarding. An individual, I'll just delete without. An individual should not bend over obediently to the state's authority, disregarding himself. Is that clear? Now, Thoreau says war is an example of how law leads men to do unjust actions. We wage war on innocent people sometimes. Just because some people in one country are violent or unjust or terrorists. Because of long time oppression, people might turn to violence also. We just wage war on them, destroy them. That is unjust. Actually, it is our injustice probably that caused their violence. Wars have happened like that. War is an example of how law leads men to do unjust actions. Sometimes we wage war just to get territory, like the Americans are waging war on Mexico at the time of Thoreau. So, war by definition, by nature, is violent. It is against human conscience. No human being who is exercising his conscience would want war. To kill people where a lot of innocent lives are destroyed. Okay, in the primitive times, in the medieval times, when human societies were undeveloped, probably war was the only solution. But today, we are highly developed societies. We have so many ways of dealing with problems and conflicts and resolving them. So many negotiations and, discussions can take place that might lead to resolution of conflicts. We can use political pressure and so many other ways in which we can deal with other communities and countries. Why do we need this medieval, primitive institution of war at all? But it is increasing day by day. Primarily, I am led to believe that the medieval, primitive institution of war is not going out of human societies because there is money involved in it. Because there are arms and ammunition industries that are benefiting from war. And it is so easy to manipulate human minds these days through media and technology. War brings money to people, some people. That is why war is not going out. But we don't actually need war. War, says Thoreau, is an example of how law leads men to do unjust actions. And remember, he said this before the First World War, before the Second World War, before all the horrendous wars in the world, most of which was waged by America on others in the 20th century. Soldiers, says Thoreau, are as individuals inclined to peace. Nobody is born in this world thinking, okay, I'll kill other people. I want to wage war on other people and kill other people. Nobody is born into the world like that. Soldiers are inclined to peace as individuals, but because of their undue respect for law, they take part in war against their will, against their common sense, against conscience, knowing that war is damnable business. Because soldiers are brainwashed into thinking that war is good. Soldiers in a standing army serve the state not as men but as machines. They are no longer human beings. They are treated like objects, and they have become machines or wooden men, having no opportunity to exercise their moral sense. They have the same sort of worth only as horses and dogs. Thoreau is saying this not an insult of soldiers, but with indignation at how human beings are being misused by the state. What life do soldiers have? They have to live in very horrid conditions away from their families and loved ones. Risk their lives always. What for? Who gains from it? And ultimately they lose their moral sense. They lose their humaneness. They become killing machines. And yet they are considered good citizens. Look at the photograph of trench fighting of the First World War. I should have put a picture of the Second World War as well, which created wastelands out of Europe. What are these people fighting for in the trenches? Many of them died of diseases and lack of food and trauma. Almost all of them suffered from shell shock. What for? What did humanity gain from it? To show how soldiers who die in a war are dehumanized, Thoreau quotes from the first stanza of Charles Wolfe's poem, The Burial of Sir John Moore at Corunna. This poem describes the simple burial of a soldier without fanfare. And then Thoreau says, complete submission is not good service. Similarly, most legislators, politicians, lawyers, ministers, and office holders do not serve with their conscience. Even the people who work in the government, legislators, politicians, lawyers, ministers, and office holders do not serve with their conscience, but only with their heads. Thoreau says they are likely to serve the devil without intending it as God. Politicians, lawyers, ministers, they are serving the devil thinking that he's God. A few who serve the state with their conscience are treated by the state as enemies. A few people who serve the state with their conscience are treated by the state as their enemies. I am reminded of the former Reserve Bank governor in India. Thoreau quotes from Hamlet to prove that a wise man is useful only as long as he remains a man. As clay. In Hamlet, Hamlet says this about Caesar. As long as Caesar is a man, he is useful as a wise man. But when he is dead as clay, he will serve to stop a hole and nothing else. Once you lose your humanity and life, you are no good. Preserve your humaneness. Preserve your conscience. This is the theme of many war novels. I'm reminded of Catch-22. I'm reminded of Catch-22, where Captain John Yossarian has to fight to preserve his mind and conscience. Thoreau quotes then from King John to show that a man should retain his sovereignty over himself. One who gives himself over completely to fellow men is only useless and cannot be considered a philanthropist. One who gives himself over completely to fellow men is only useless and cannot be considered a philanthropist. You should retain your sovereignty over yourself. That is the first thing that you should do as a human being. Soldiers do not do that. This is a painting by Hogarth from the neoclassical period where judges and legislators are made fun of. And next we come to the second section of the essay, against civil government. That will be another video. Hope you enjoyed the first part. Thank you very much.